Jacobson, the MLA for Nunavut and chair of the committee today, will receive a briefing from Minister Diane Archie and her staff regarding major infrastructure projects. The Standing Committee is a role to review legislation introduced into the House. We also identify priorities related to economic development and environment in the NWT. Today's meeting is being live streamed on Assembly social media. I'd like to remind the members and presenters to direct all questions through me. Before speaking, I'll recognize you, then this meeting will run smoothly. We'll do the members' introductions, starting with Jay.
Jane Whalen Armstrong, MLA for Mufi.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Ron Bonderdroos, Dead Choke.
And we also have Caitlin Cleveland, member joining us here today. Thank you for coming, Caitlin. We'll now invite Minister Archie to introduce herself and proceed with her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On request of the committee, we are here to provide an update on the status of our government strategic energy and infrastructure projects, specifically the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Slave Geological Province Corridor, and the Tolton Hydro Expansion. So with me from the Department of Infrastructure, I have Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy and Strategic Initiatives, Mr. Robert Jenkins. Director of Strategic Energy Infrastructure, Mr. Andrew Sturt. Director of Strategic Infrastructure, Mr. Seth Binet. And Director of Transportation, Mr. Binay Yadav. Mr. Chair, strategic infrastructure projects are key to building critical connections needed here in the Northwest Territories to bring communities together to support an improved quality of life and stabilized cost of living for all residents. As we recover from the impacts of COVID-19, these strategic projects will play a significant role in the economy recovery process. These initiatives will inject money into the economy, provide business, employment capacity building, and skill development opportunities for our residents, while supporting the expansion and diversification of the economy. It is our department's priority to ensure each of these projects are designed to maximize benefits to Northwest Territories residents, both economically, and socially. I can reaffirm with you all today that advancing development of the Mackenzie Valley Highway, Slave Geological Province Corridor, and the Tolton Hydro Expansion projects remain key priorities of this 19th Assembly as part of the mandate commitments to the GNWT, and also represent our best opportunity to advance the Department of Infrastructure's transportation strategy and the 2030 energy strategy. I will now ask Mr. Robert Jenkins to deliver a presentation on the strategic energy and infrastructure projects, and following that we will respond to any questions that your committee may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us today to provide an update on the GNWT strategic energy and infrastructure projects. Can we move to slide number 2? So by way of an overview, I will speak quickly to the GNWT strategic investments, and then we'll get into project-specific updates for each of the components that make up the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Slave Geological Province Corridor, and the Tolton Hydro Expansion Project. Slide number 3. So you're all aware that these 3 strategic investments have been prioritized for advancement by the Government of Northwest Territories in the mandate of the 19th Legislative Assembly. All 3 of these projects are intended to provide the foundational infrastructure to support an improved quality of life and lower cost of living for NWT residents, as well as to support the expansion and diversification of the economy helping to advance the implementation of the 2030 energy strategy, as well as connecting us the NWT transportation strategy. Slide number 4. Indigenous partnerships and support for these projects is and will continue to be vital to the success of each, as they have the potential to bring improved inter-community mobility, enhanced social opportunities, and lower cost of living and doing business in the Northwest Territories. All 3 projects will inject money into the NWT economy, providing business, employment, and training opportunities for residents, while delivering the critical infrastructure the NWT needs to continue to provide important programs and services. New economic opportunities will also be realized, including through increased tourism and increased access for mineral and petroleum resource development, which will play a significant part in the economic recovery of the NWT from the effects of COVID-19. These projects will also help us adapt to a changing climate, and the Tolton project in particular will also help us advance towards our emissions reductions goals, while at the same time working to green the mining sector. Slide number 5, please. The Mackenzie Valley Highway project, in particular, is focused on replacing 321 kilometers of winter road between Wrigley and Norman Wells with an all-season 2-lane gravel highway that will improve the resiliency of the NWT transportation system to the effects of climate change. As you're all aware, NWT winter road systems are being severely impacted by climate change, which is expected to increase challenges in coming years. The MVH will bring improved inter-community mobility in the face of a changing climate, enhance social opportunities, and lower the cost of living and doing business in the region. The project itself will do this by directly injecting money in the economy, providing business, employment, and training opportunities through construction activities. In addition, new economic opportunities may also be realized, including through increased tourism, increased access for mineral and petroleum resource development. The preliminary construction cost of the MVH is estimated to be upwards of $700 million. This is a preliminary estimate, which will be updated and refined as the project advances through engineering and design. Slide number 6, please. The all-season road is advancing in phases as regulatory approvals are obtained and funding is secured. The GNWT has completed or has been working to advance several short road extensions along the MVH alignment. This includes the Canyon Creek, Prohibition Creek, and Mount Cadet access roads. These smaller construction projects are intended as community capacity building projects that advance separately from the MVH environmental assessment with community support and approval of the regulatory boards. Work on the Great Bear River Bridge project is also advancing. At the same time, the GNWT is working to complete the MVH environmental assessment and regulatory process, as well as the engineering and design work. Moving to slide 7. It is important to note that the advancement of the MVH is enabled by the ongoing financial support of the federal government. In 2017, the GNWT secured $20 million under Infrastructure Canada's New Building Canada Plan to advance the planning, engineering, and construction of the Canyon Creek access road. That was followed in 2018 with the securing of an additional $140 million under Transport Canada's National Trade Corridors Fund to advance the Mckenzie Valley Highway environmental assessment, as well as the planning, engineering, and construction of the Great Bear River Bridge and Mount Cadet access road. And last year, the GNWT secured an additional $20 million under Infrastructure Canada's Investing in Canada infrastructure plan for the planning, engineering, and construction of the Prohibition Creek Access Road. This represents a total commitment of $180 million since 2017, which is cost shared between the Government of Canada and the GWT on a 75-25 basis. Slide 8, please. The Canyon Creek Access Road was the first of the shorter road extension projects to advance. As mentioned, this 14-kilometer section of the Mackenzie Valley Highway from Normanwell south to Canyon Creek was funded under Infrastructure Canada's New Building Canada Plan in 2017, total cost of $20 million. Design, engineering, permitting, and procurement were completed, and the project broke ground in early 2017, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony took place 23 months later, in November 2018, to celebrate the completion of construction. Construction activity peaked in March 2018, with 81 people being employed on the project, 36 of which were local Sati residents, and 28 of which were Northerners from other parts of the territory. This project offered training opportunities for approximately 12 trainees and 16 heavy equipment operators. The road provides increased reliability for shipments of essential supplies and easier access to traditional hunting and fishing areas. Slide 9, please. Building on the success of the Canyon Creek Access Road project, the Prohibition Creek Access Road project is planned to encompass an additional 13 kilometers from Canyon Creek south to Prohibition Creek. As already mentioned, $20 million has been secured for this project under Infrastructure Canada's Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan. Regulatory authorizations for the construction of the road have been completed. However, this summer, engineering and design concerns were identified at the Christina Creek crossing, which will require a portion of the creek to be rerouted. Additional permitting and engineering and design work will be required. In an effort to minimize delay to the project timeline, we have now tendered phase 1 of the PCAR construction work, which will see the construction of that portion of the road between Canyon Creek and Christina Creek, which is 7 kilometers. Of note, the phase 1 tender closes today. The remaining 6 kilometers of the road, phase 2 of the Prohibition Creek Access Road construction, will be tendered once the permitting and design work associated with the rerouting Christina Creek is complete and include this additional work. We are still anticipating construction may be completed as early as 2024. Slide 10. The Mount Cadet Access Road project includes the 15-kilometer portion of the NBH alignment from Wrigley north to Mount Cadet. Funding for MGAR was included in the $140 million secured in 2018 under Transport Canada's National Trade Corridors Fund Agreement. Regulatory permit applications were submitted to the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board in the fall 2020. However, the GWT has requested and received a pause in the permitting process in order to have discussions with the Pizique First Nation regarding concerns raised with the project. This is our current focus. We hope to be able to resume the regulatory process in 2022. Slide 11. Funding has been secured under Transport Canada's National Trade Corridors Fund to complete environmental and engineering studies and facilitate construction of the Great Bear River Bridge. The Great Bear River Bridge project team is currently undertaking extensive community and stakeholder engagement while advancing environmental and engineering studies to inform final design and construction. The GWT is anticipating regulatory approvals and construction procurement in 2023. Provided there are no significant delays, Great Bear River Bridge is anticipated to take 3 years to construct and be substantially completed in 2026. Slide 12. Finally, we continue to advance work on the environmental assessment of the remaining road alignment. While the initial project description was submitted in 2012 with a referral to EA in 2013, substantive funding needed to undertake the EA was not secured from Canada until 2018. Slide 13. In 2018, the GMT secured $140 million under Transport Canada's National Trade Corridors Fund to advance the Mackenzie Valley Highway project through the environmental assessment process, construct Great Bear River Bridge and Cadet Access Road. The project team was immediately established and engagement initiated with all project's stakeholders, which led to the establishment of a memorandum of understanding between the SOT2 Secretariat Incorporated and GNVT regarding cooperation on the advancement of the Mackenzie Valley Highway through the environmental review and regulatory process in 2019. Over the course of the last 2 years, extensive work has been undertaken to conduct desktop and field studies to gather environmental and engineering baseline data to support regulatory applications and the environmental assessment, including but not limited to fish and fish habitat studies, hydrological assessments of water crossings, archaeological surveys and impact assessments, wildlife surveys for caribou moose and other species of importance to communities, bore source assessments, and hydrotechnical assessments. Community members have been involved throughout these activities. Baseline data and advancing engagement with community stakeholders on traditional knowledge, traditional land and resource studies, socioeconomic impact assessment, and the compilation of all data collected to date into a developer's assessment report for submission to EMBER will be undertaken in 2022. Slide 14, please. So once the developer's assessment report is submitted, which as mentioned, expected in fall 2022, the review board process kicks into full swing again. Typically, the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board will facilitate technical sessions and public hearings to ensure all stakeholders have an opportunity to participate in the project review and to inform the review board's review and recommendations on the project. It's important to note that timelines for the completion of the review board's process are legislated, as is the timeline for the responsible minister's final decision upon receipt of the review board's report of environmental assessment. We do not anticipate the environmental assessment process to be completed prior to 2024, after which another year will be required to obtain regulatory authorizations for construction. Pending our ability to secure funding for construction, procurement and construction will follow thereafter. I will note that we're working closely with other GNVT departments to understand and mitigate the potential impacts of the project on the environment and people. The GNVT is also reviewing the lessons learned report from the Tleacho All-Season Road Environmental Assessment and will apply them to the MVHEA as appropriate. Slide 15. The Slate Geological Province Corridor project involves the construction of approximately 413 kilometers of all-season road from Tibbet Lake at the end of the Ingham Trail, Highway 4 to the NWT near the border. Currently, each winter, a Tibbet to Contito Winter Road is constructed to support mining operations in the region. Construction of the SGP is intended to improve the reliability of resupply infrastructure to existing and proposed mines in the Slave Geological Province, which are being impacted by changing climate, support communications and clean energy infrastructure, as well as reduce exploration and development costs, thereby increasing the attractiveness of the region to new economic investment opportunities in this mineral-rich area. Should be noted that the Grays Bay Porton Road advances in Nunavut. The potential would exist for the Slave Geological Province Corridor to link to the Grays Bay Porton Road, creating a transportation corridor through the NWT to a deep sea port. Similar to the NVH, the project itself will inject money into the economy, providing business, employment, and training opportunities for residents. The SGP All-Season Road is proposed to advance in phases as regulatory approvals are obtained and construction funding is secured. In 2019, the GNVT secured $40 million under Transport Canada's National Trade Corridors Fund for the environmental assessment and planning associated with the project. We're currently focusing our attention on the section of the road between Tibbet and Lockhart Lake. We recognize that effective Indigenous and public engagement as cornerstones for successful project planning and development. Continuous proactive engagement is vital, is a vital investment for the long-term success of the SGP project. We are committed to working with Indigenous governments, Indigenous and community organizations, the public, regulatory authorities regarding the SGP project, to inform them about project planning and development, and to listen and to consider their input. This will continue to be our focus as we move into 2022. At the same time, project work has been advancing. In 2021, archaeological assessments were initiated at potential borrow sites, and the GMT is preparing a land use permit application that could enable geotech work to advance starting next year. We are aware that the Sleacho government has submitted a request to the federal government to initiate a regional strategic environmental assessment for the Slave Geological Province. While the decision has yet to be made by Canada on this request, the environmental and planning work we are advancing for the SGP could complement and benefit a regional strategic environmental assessment should one proceed. As with the MVH, the SGP is enabled by the ongoing financial support from the federal government. 2019, we secured $40 million under the NTCF to advance environmental and planning studies for the corridor. And last year, the GMT secured an additional $50 million under the NTCF for replacement of the Frank-Channel Bridge. This represents a total commitment of $90 million, which is again cost share between the Government of Canada and the GMT on a 75-25 basis. Slide 18, please. The replacement of Frank-Channel Bridge has been included as a critical component of the Slave Geological Province Corridor Project, as the existing bridge is nearing the end of its serviceable life and acts as a current operational bottleneck for industrial loads moving north to Yellowknife and beyond. The GMT has secured $50 million under the NTCF for this work, and work to secure regulatory authorizations is currently underway. Slide 19. So moving to the Tolton expansion project. The Tolton expansion project builds upon the existing 18 megawatt facility which supplies power to communities in the South Slave. Our immediate focus is towards phase one of the project, which includes building a 60 megawatt expansion next to the existing power plant at Twin Gorges on the Tolton River and extending a transmission line either across or around Great Slave Lake to connect our two legacy hydro systems and provide clean hydro power north and south of Great Slave Lake. The expansion project is very attractive from an environmental perspective because it can be built without any new flooding and will provide the foundational green hydro system necessary to stabilize the cost of energy in the 10 communities around Great Slave Lake, while supporting the industrial and transportation sectors to transition away from fossil fuels. We remain at the project definition or feasibility stage of the project, with a great deal of work left to do. Future phases of work will need to proceed on their own merits, but the vision includes the extension of an energy, communications and transportation corridor into the Slave Geological Province, and even further out, the benefits of connecting the NMT to the rest of Canada, either through Saskatchewan or Alberta, has the potential to occur after 2040. Slide 20. With 100% funding in place from the federal government, we're in a strong position to continue feasibility work on the project. The current focus is on developing Indigenous partnerships, refining the business case, and selecting a preferred transmission line route for the project. We're making progress in all areas and expect to be able to share the business case prior to the end of this fiscal year. We're also working with our partners to define the decision process for selecting the preferred route for the project, comparing relative costs, risks, and environmental impacts. The Memorandum of Understanding and Statement of Principles that we have with Indigenous governments will define how we work together on the project, and this was an important first step in moving forward. Slide 21. The MOU is a commitment between the GNBT and Indigenous partners to work together to advance the project through established working groups under direction of the steering committee. Work is underway on the business case with expected delivery by the end of this fiscal year. Work on the technical and engineering aspects of the project, such as routing options, is also being advanced by the partners. Slide 22. We are continuing technical work on the 4 identified options to install a power line between Twin Gorges and the snare system in Yellowknife. Currently, we're in the process of developing a comparative analysis to compare technology options, capital costs, construction and operations risks, Indigenous knowledge, traditional land use, and potential environmental impacts. We've learned a great deal about the different options and expect to arrive at a preferred route for the project in 2022 in order to focus our efforts on developing a regulatory application for the project. Quick snapshot of what we've learned in the last two seasons of bathymetry work on Great Slave Lake and focused technical work on the 4 primary routes. I'll discuss those over the next 4 slides. The western Great Slave Lake route would follow the road as much as possible, and at 805 kilometers is the longest of the options considered. This is a very long and lightly loaded overhead transmission line. Fortunately, the route is road accessible for most of its length. The route will either need to pass through or around Wood Buffalo National Park. There are also 2 major river crossings, a 1,000 meter crossing over the Slave River and a 2,000 meter crossing over the Mackenzie River. A number of concepts have been considered for crossing the Mackenzie River, including beneath the deck on the Deschaux Bridge, horizontal directional drilling under the river, and 2 shorter overhead crossings using Meridian Island west of Fort Providence. Slide 24, please. Bathymetric survey information collected on Great Slave Lake is being reviewed as part of the submarine cable route work. More information on the lakebed survey will be presented on the next slide. A direct submarine cable route is preferred, but will need to migrate west from Stony Isle, away from shallow and rugged areas that prevent reasonable access to Montonaby Point and Grocap. Complex project logistics need proper planning and scheduling allowances. In current estimates, allowances have been made for a 2-year delivery and cable lay. Cable would come from either Asia or Europe and be delivered through the Western Arctic to the Beaufort Sea area, where it is transferred to barges to be shipped up the Mackenzie River to Hay River. Hay River Port would be a staging area for submarine cable logistics, and this is a relatively long cable in terms of submarine power cable projects, so we expect it will attract interest from cable manufacturers. Slide 25. Arctic Research Foundation have worked with the GNBT to complete a 2-year bathymetric survey program over 2019 and 2020. This program has helped to characterize uncharted lakebed corridors through Great Slave Lake. The surveyors use multi-beam, side scan, and sub-bottom profile equipment to survey and develop charts for use as part of the submarine cable work. This work has helped identify lakebed characteristics, including some cable hazards, which include, for example, ice scour in the south of Great Slave Lake, exposed rock through the islands and in Grocap and Montonaby area, and steep slopes with unstable sediments. Bathymetric survey work will inform submarine cable routing options. Slide 26. And finally, Mr. Chair, we are assessing the Simpson Island route. Most of this route is not road accessible. Only the section along the Ingham Trail is accessible. The route follows Canadian Shield and is mainly founded on bedrock. Submarine cable sections are extremely short in terms of submarine power cable projects. There is limited information on the lakebed characteristics at the crossing locations, but we know that the Hearn Channel is very deep and is likely due to steep side slopes. There are 4 major overhead transmission crossings on the island hopping section and could require towers up to 125 meters tall for long crossings. The construction of tall towers would require specialist helicopters such as sky cranes. And that's an overview of the work on our routing options. Slide 27. So thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes our update on these important strategic infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. We do have questions from my members. We'll go 2 questions each. And if we have enough time, we'll put you back on the list, and want my questions brief and my answers just as brief as the questions. So we could get through everybody today. Thank you, Madam Minister. First on this, I have Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's always good to see the members or the people from infrastructure here. I'm going to start my question off with Tolton because it was the last one discussed. So as a science nerd, I'm really excited to see all of this data being collected, and I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing the technical reports from the department on where this is going. I guess one of my questions is, you had mentioned in the presentation the first phase was not going to include any additional flooding. Yet I do hear a lot of characterization about this widespread environmental destruction that will happen with the Phase 1 expansion. Could you maybe speak a little bit to that? What kind of environmental impacts, or provide a bit more detail on them in the Phase 1 expansion? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to, that's a very good technical question that I don't know offhand, so I'm going to ask Andrew Stewart, Mr. Stewart, to speak on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Tolton Hydro Expansion Project, as most folks know, is the optimization of the Twin Gorges facility, which already includes an 18 megawatt facility. It also has a control structure up at Nanacho Lake that has been in place since the late 60s as well. That control structure has the capacity to take on an additional 60 megawatts without any new flooding. We simply need to upgrade the control structure at Nanacho Lake, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I had that right, that there really is no environmental impact for the first Phase 1 expansion. So I think it's clear that people recognize that. My next question is on the Mackenzie Valley Highway. You've mentioned the various phases of projects that are on the books and that we have money for, and I really cannot emphasize how much I support this project, as I did my statement on it last week. Once those projects that are on the books are completed, will the highway actually be complete? Will people be able to drive from Yellowknife all the way through to Norman Wells? Or what pieces are still left under the Mackenzie Valley Highway to secure funding for? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to hear the members very excited for Mackenzie Valley Highway, because I am as well, and I'm sure you are too, Mr. Chair. But in addition, I'm going to get Seth Bennett to speak a little bit more about what the plan is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The funding we currently have enables us to complete the environmental assessment for the portion of the road between Wrigley and Norman Wells, as well as the shorter extension roads, Prohibition Creek Access Road and Mount Cadet Access Road. Once the environmental assessment is complete, we will be required to seek additional funding to complete construction activities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Does that complete the whole highway, Mr. Bennett, or you just?
No, just say.
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I heard there that, assuming Tulsa goes through all its phases, we would anticipate being able to connect to Alberta or Saskatchewan by 2040. Can I just get a little bit of an explanation on why that would take so long? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I really enjoyed I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation, because there was a lot of great detail. And you're looking at the Tulsa Highway, and we're still early phases of the project. But if I can, Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Andrew to speak on it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have done some investigation into both of the Saskatchewan and Alberta markets. The reality is that a 60 megawatt project is very small for those jurisdictions to attract much interest. The Alberta Electricity Systems Operator has indicated they may need power by 2040 to serve their needs. And Saskatchewan actually has looked at other options for their own jurisdiction, where they have hydropower of a similar scale that can meet their needs within their own boundaries. And so we're simply not an attractive option at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I understand. It's a matter of they don't have a need to buy our power right now. And I know in Alberta, well, obviously they have just significantly more power. And as industry winds down, they've had a surplus in areas. I've asked this question a number of times to a number of people, and no one's ever been able to explain it to me. We're waiting to 2040 because it would only make sense to connect if we could sell some of our surplus energy. But why can't, when I look at Alberta's energy price or Saskatchewan's, it's really attractive. Why can't we just connect to their grids and buy their power? Why would we build our own facility? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Minister.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to have Mr. Stewart speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, or Madam Minister. Mr. Stewart, 2 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A key part of the strategy for developing green infrastructure for the NWT is to impact the GHG emission profile of our own territory and to provide clean energy for industry. The markets to the south do not have a high percentage of renewable energy currently in their energy mix, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Next on the list, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick comments. Tolton is not green power, even the 18 megawatts that are there. You cannot eat fish. There's a public health advisory for lake trout in the Nacho Lake, the headwaters. They're contaminated with mercury. It's not green power. I just want to get that out there. It's greener perhaps than some other forms, but it's not green power. Yeah, and if I had $1 billion to spend, I'd much rather spend it on getting our housing out of core need than at least a couple of these mega projects. But when are we going to get a business plan for the Slave Geological Province Road, and who's doing that? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to note, like, all these major projects here are a priority of this 19th Assembly, and it is my mandate to be able to advance some of these projects. And I'm going to ask Mr. Jenkins to speak a little bit more about Mr. O'Reilly's question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we did do a 2019 economic study of the project, and we looked at a number of different scenarios for mineral exploration and development. We did a low scenario, a medium scenario, and a high scenario. And all those scenarios, the economic analysis shown that they represent a reasonable view that the all-season road into the Slave Geological Province corridor, really it shows that all scenarios had a positive net present value, so that there were benefits from advancing the project. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks. So, okay, if that 2019 study is the business plan, I think we're in trouble. Because it does show that I think at any of the stages of the operation of the road or construction, that less than 50% of the jobs and benefits would actually stay here. So I'm not sure why we would do it. I think we would probably get more jobs, better distributed, and retain more benefits if we spend $1 billion on getting our housing out of core need. But I want to ask about the lessons learned from the Clecho all-season road, how those are being applied to the Mackenzie Valley Highway and the Slave Geological Province. It looks like this environmental assessment for the Mackenzie Valley Highway is probably going to set a world record at more than 14 years. So what are those lessons learned, and how are they going to be applied to the Mackenzie Valley Highway and the SGP road? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Madam Minister, you want to go to Mr. Jenkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, before I do that, I just want to make note that he is meeting with the Department of Lands today, so I'll let him speak a little bit more to Mr. O'Reilly's question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank the member for the question. So we are meeting with the Department of Lands, and coincidentally enough, have a meeting this afternoon on this topic. As we sort of advance the planning of this, of these major infrastructure projects, we need to look at how we, as a government, approach the environmental review process. Obviously, there was a review of the TASER environmental assessment. It talked about many different things. There's a number of recommendations through that. And how do we approach this project from a government? Do we do a whole of government approach? Do we advance it with different departments taking different roles? These are things we need to define and things that we will define as we move forward towards the regulatory phase of these important projects. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Next on the list, I have Mr. Bonitrush.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Merci to the Minister and her staff for the update on the projects. I guess a lot of them are really, people are looking forward to economic stimulus for our territory, and these projects speak well to that. Considering that we're using majority of federal dollars, and if there's any partnerships in there, then you can also access the partnership dollars, hopefully, in there. I note the Great Bear River Bridge. Like you're going to be building a bridge there, and considering that, you know, Fort Simpson, you know, been crying for a bridge forever, and we're not building no bridge there, but we're building a bridge here. I'm just wondering if there was a cost analysis or anything done relative to just a ferry rather than a bridge, if I may ask that. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Bonitrush. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry about that. You know, yes, the member brings up the Indigenous Partnership, and I think that's really important as we, you know, look at some of the infrastructure projects here in the territories. And we continue to do that, you know, our engagements with the Indigenous group. Going back to the question of ferry versus bridge, I'm going to see if, I'll ask Mr. Binet to, Yadab to speak on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Binet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regarding Indigenous involvement, we have several projects already aligned. Giving you some few examples, like Highway 1 project, we have a partnership, Diga and Rose, they have already started construction this year. Highway 7, we have AKDFN and Beaver Enterprises with roads. So we have some projects which are already in progress. And coming to that bridge part, so any infrastructure generally, there are several stages of work before prior going to construction, like pre-engineering, like geotech, hydrotech, and those things. So for Liard River Bridge, we are progressing for some engineering study. So once those are done, then we'll be moving forward with next step for that. So some reports we are anticipating in next 1 or 2 months for that initial study for that bridge. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Binet, Mr. Bonitrush.
Merci, Mr. Chair. So we don't have any costs at the present time for the bridge versus ferry analysis. That's what I'm kind of taking away, because I didn't hear anything there. So hopefully we get some of those answers at some point, because I'd be really interested in the scope of the bridge at that location. Yeah, because we're just bypassing Fort Simpson, who's been crying for years. Talking about the Tolton Hydro, I know we're looking at partnerships, and lots of these, the 3 major contracts, it kind of speaks towards just sole sourcing to First Nations. The Tulsa one is interesting, as you listed about 6 or 7 different organizations there, and I'm wondering how that partnership will work if you're looking at that, because when you're looking at partnerships business, profits are everything. And my concern is that we may be cutting corners just to gain a profit margin on this. I'm just wondering if someone could speak to that, Masi.
Thank you, Mr. Bonjous. Madam Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, since 2019, we focused on developing relationship with our Indigenous partners, working to build a business case, examine some of the line routings. Oh, I'm going to ask Mr. Jenkins to speak to that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So as mentioned, since June, we've been working under an MOU with the NWT Métis Nation and the Akecho-Dene First Nations to advance the project. And, that sort of will also, as we develop a business case, we're going to have to look at sort of, some of the economic aspects of the project as we move forward as partners. So that will be defined. It is important. Obviously, there's interest by the Indigenous governments to share, in the benefits of that project. And those are discussions that are underway, but at a preliminary stage, and they will continue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Next on the list, I have Ms. Wayellen Armstrong. Ms. Armstrong.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I'm going to be speaking to the Frank Channel Bridge. I see the federal government, or it says 50 million here on this in this report. So I want to say that I believe in economic development. Okay, I believe in economic development. It will provide training and employment. So that is good. But working with the Indigenous government from the region is also, it is very important, because I know that it's not like 30, 40, 50 years ago where there was no consultations. Now there's, it seems like you guys are making consultation. So, and then from this report, I see that you made some MOU with other, especially with regards to the Tulsa, and there's no MOU with Klutch government for Frank Channel Bridge. Why is that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wayellen Armstrong. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the Frank Channel Bridge, we have been engaging with the Klutch government, excuse me, and we do have an intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the Klutch. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Ms. Wayellen Armstrong.
When is the actual date for the constructions and the contract? Who will be getting most of the contract, and who are going to be employed more with regards to this Frank Channel Bridge? Thank you.
Thank you, Armstrong. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, during our presentation, I mentioned that we just recently received some funding for this project. So, having said that, we're still really early in the stages. Perhaps more at the design stage and looking at some cost estimates. But the funding we received was mostly just to do the whole assessments and construction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Next on the list, I have Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Right now, the mines build the ice road. I believe it costs them about $20 million a year to build and operate. I know Lockhart Lake is only a part of that, but has there been any conversations, or is there any appetite about industry making a contribution to building this, either through P3 contracting or some other arrangement? I know it would probably save them a few $1 million a year having an all-season road. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as we advance the project and look at some of the different options, I'm going to ask Mr. Jenkins to speak a little bit more about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've got funding right now for SGP to work through the environmental assessment and planning phases. So we're going to advance that to the regulatory. But as we move closer, we've done economic studies. We're going to need to sort of assess once we advance towards construction, how are we going to do that? And this is an option that we need to look at. is there an appetite by industry to contribute to that? That is definitely something we're going to have to assess and discussions we're going to have. Right now, we're really in that sort of data collection phase and the assessment phase. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, a similar question for Tolton. I guess the worst case scenario here is we build this and we have a surplus, as we already have a surplus in the South Slave and no one to buy it.
You can speak.
Are we?
Madam Minister, your mic's on.
Sorry about that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I guess are we in a position of having any conversations with industry and entering any sort of MOUs of who would actually buy the power? I know, we're just such a long way from getting those hydro lines to the diamond mines that they'll probably be closed. I'm just wondering, is there anyone who would potentially be interested, or are we just not there yet in purchasing within territory? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask Mr. Stewart to speak on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are in fact engaged with the mining industry in the NWT. We do need on the order of 2 to 3 mines in order to make this project viable. And so we're continuing to monitor what's in the public realm and what opportunities might emerge as we have better certainty about our costs and where our transmission line route will go. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Next on the list, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Mr. Chair. So, as I understand it, I think Diavik is scheduled to close in about maybe 3 years. Gachokui has maybe, 5-7 years of life left. Acadie, Arctic Canadian Diamond says they're not going ahead with Jay. They, I think, with Point Lake, maybe have another 4 years of life. They are talking about some untried submersible mining method, but it's just not clear to me why we would build a road to the SGP when 3 diamond mines that are active are going to be closing in the next decade. So, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect any kind of contribution from them as well. So I'm trying to be convinced that it's worthwhile spending $1 billion+ on a road that wouldn't go anywhere. I'd like to get a response. Thanks, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the correction. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask Mr. Jenkins to speak about that.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the key piece here, Mr. Chair, is providing the foundational infrastructure to really support future economic activity. We did do a 2019 economic study on SGP that did result in basically all mining exploration and development scenarios in that area being assessed, showed that we had a net present value, positive net present value of that. If we advance the Tolton project up into that area, really we're providing helping our ability to make significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the industry sector. We'd be providing clean energy to future mining operations in that area. Really, it's giving that backbone green infrastructure as well to support that transformation and having access to green energy and making the region appealing to future development. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Jenkins, next on this, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm just wondering, has this question, I guess, for the minister, has our government actually done any sort of macro or comparative economic analysis of, if we did have a $1 billion sitting in a bank account and we could spend it on anything, have we looked at, how much we could create in terms of jobs, where they would be distributed, and what kind of economic activity would be generated if we invested $1 million into housing versus $1 million, or $1 billion, I should say, in housing versus investing $1 billion into, say, the SGP or Tolton? Has that work been done? And if not, why? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly, Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as we look at all the different projects here, and keeping in mind that this is a priority of this Assembly, and looking at the projects, before we do any major work, we do assessments to be able to look at economic viability. So, I mean, those are important. I don't specifically know what we'd do if we had $1 billion in our bank, but that's probably not going to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. O'Reilly, I'll give you.
No, I just think that work does need to be done, and I'm hoping that it's some of the kind of work that I think needs to be done as part of the regional study if the federal government agrees. And thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your comment, Madam Minister. I'll give you the opportunity to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, that is a really good point. I mean, this is something that is government-wide, not just infrastructure specific. And I'll take that as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Next on this, I have Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is around the deep sea ports again. I know that, it'd be great if we could link up a road into Nunavut, and I would always support that. But has there been any work done to potentially advocate or discuss with the federal government whether or not a port is viable for the NWT up and around the Beaufort Delta area, especially with the given interest or the renewed interest probably from the federal government for sovereignty and the D&D in the north? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. That's Tuktiaktuk. Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you look at the Mackenzie Valley Highway and trying to advance this project up to the Beaufort Delta, and I'm sure you'd be happy to hear about that as well. But we haven't really spoken about a port in Tuck. I'm going to see if Jenkins can add further to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Mr. Jenkins, give us some good news there.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, with Grays Bay Port Road, that's a project being advanced by, our friends over in Nunavut, and they are working to advance that. I know that they recently did secure some money to sort of look at some of the assessment of that. Obviously, there's a natural connection there if we advance SGP. We're advancing them separately, though. But there is, if they do advance, we do need to have discussions about a connection there because there could be some benefits from that. I do believe that our friends from ITI are always looking at different opportunities for economic developments, including potentially deep sea ports and other areas around the territory. I'm not sure how advanced it is, but I know that there's always been a desire to potentially develop the oil and gas industry in that region, and potentially that could be a mechanism to get that to market. But I don't have the details on that. Unfortunately, it'd be something that ITI would probably better place to speak to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Madam, Miss Katrina Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It has definitely been a long couple weeks here at the Ledge. My next, I guess further to that then, though, is liaison with the DND, though, not happening between the Department of Infrastructure and the federal government? So would your department not be involved with conversations around what's happening with expansions in Nunavik? And if not, then which department do I need to go after? Thank you.
Thank you,